I'm Jim Thrasher. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Promotion, Education, and Behavior at the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. And we've been studying e-cigarettes both in the U.S. and in a variety of other countries that have different kinds of policies around e-cigarettes and cigarettes, and trying to understand a little bit about what's going on in terms of adult use of e-cigarettes as well as use amongst youth. And what I'll be talking about today is, what are these e-cigarettes and why do they appeal to youth? First of all, I think it's really important for us to recognize that this phenomenon of e-cigarettes is in the context of the reduction of combustible cigarette use in the U.S. Here we have data in orange showing the declines in the prevalence of current smoking amongst high school students from the late 90s till today, and then also amongst adults. And so in both groups we see significant declines that are really important to recognize. And there's some argument within the public health community about the role of e-cigarettes in actually helping to accelerate the decline, although there are a lot of concerns about what's going on with Juul, which we'll be talking about today. So you may or may not realize that there are lots of different tobacco products, lots of different ways in which people can deliver nicotine into their bodies. And the two that I'll be talking about today are the electronic cigarettes, but also something called heated tobacco products. You may have heard in the last couple of weeks that the FDA has approved Philip Morris's heated tobacco product called IQOS. And so it's going to start to roll out soon, and something we need to be aware of too, and it's part of the story going forward. We'll see it in the U.S. first in Atlanta, so we may see some spillover here in South Carolina very soon. But there are a large variety of ways in which people consume nicotine through tobacco. And there are lots of different types of e-cigarettes as well. We had the first generation e-cigarettes where they actually look like cigarettes. I have an example here, but you can see very well there that they have batteries, they have atomizers, which kind of convert the liquid to a vapor, and the cartridge where you actually have the liquid in there. And these are meant to either be thrown away after use, or you can buy new cartridges and replace those cartridges. And that's kind of the first generation. The second generation are these kind of tank systems that are often called vape pens, where you can see the mouthpiece and you can see the battery at the bottom, and you have a chamber that you can refill with liquids. I have an example here, and we'll pass some of this around. The liquids often come in these kind of eyedropper type containers, and oftentimes historically the places where you can buy this, they're mixing some of the liquids together in the back of some of the shops. I bought this one from the White Octopus, which is right on UG Street here in Columbia. And then the third generation had much bigger batteries, and they still had a tank. So here's an example here, kind of what the size is like, a tank here that you can refill with liquids, and then your mouthpiece here. And the bigger battery allows for heating at a higher temperature, which a lot of vapors like because they can produce these gigantic clouds. There's something about the aesthetics of breathing out a cloud that appeals to a lot of people. But what's really kind of changed the scene here in the U.S. are these Juuls. I imagine most of you all are familiar with the Juuls, or at least you've heard the term at this point. They're much smaller. I have one right here, and we'll pass a number of them around later. And they have both the battery component, and then they have these little cartridges that are full of liquid. And each cartridge contains the equivalent of about 200 puffs, which, if you think about a cigarette being about 10 puffs per cigarette, it's essentially the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes in terms of how it is that people are using it. So we'll talk more about Juul, and what's been really remarkable is the growth of Juul over the last 2 years. Here you can see the different companies that have been in the U.S. market from 2011 to 2017, the end of 2017. And we had the major tobacco industry in there with their products. But at the beginning of 2017, you start to see the red bar start to increase. And that's Juul beginning to grow. And then later data, we see at the beginning of 2018, the sales of Juul products really skyrocket and become dominant in the U.S. market. So Juul is really controlling the market in the U.S. at this point, and increasingly seeking markets in other countries. Partly in response to this growing use of Juul, there's been a lot of concern around youth use of Juul that's hitting the headlines, and that's part of the reason why we're here today. But how does it work? Well, you have this device here that has the battery. You increasingly have a variety of different cases that you can get to kind of accessorize and make it seem a little more attractive than the traditional black color that you buy it in. There are 7, 8 different flavors, including classic tobacco flavors, but mint and menthol, creme brulee, fruit medley, and cool cucumber and mango. Those are the ones that you have available. But there are other companies out there that are making these pods that you can actually insert into your Juul device, and they have a whole lot of more flavors than those that Juul itself offers. And then what you do to charge it up is you stick it in this little charger that you can see there at the bottom that sticks into a USB port that you can charge in your computer or any number of other kinds of device, or the little the housing that you would use to plug your electronic devices into the wall to recharge them. So it's relatively easy to charge. It charges up pretty quickly, and again, it's pretty easy to hide as well. The other thing is that there's a whole variety of these. So not only do we have the arrival of this, but we have the arrival of other similar systems that also use these pods. And you can see here the different types, and you can see how hard it is to recognize it as an e-cigarette as well. Some of them look like highlighters that kids may have in their backpack for doing their homework. And so one of the challenges that we have in thinking about some of the policies that we may want to promote is how do we identify what these products are? How do we train teachers and educators and parents to identify these things? So, why is it that youth are using these things in the first place? It's really a combination of 3 factors. Part of it is the advertising that we saw in the short that was just aired. Some of it has to do with the flavors, the availability of attractive flavors, and also the fact that there is actually nicotine in this product as well, and so people can get addicted on it. You may or may not know that e-cigarette advertising is much less regulated than cigarette advertising, and so you see in a lot of the advertising imagery that you wouldn't see for regular combustible tobacco products. And in some ways, it's almost recalling some of the campaigns that we used to see around cigarette products from 20, 30, 40 years ago, but updated for the current century. And another important component of the e-cigarette advertising, as well as cigarette advertising, is the use of social media. So we saw that on the spot aired earlier today. And we know that tobacco companies are increasingly using social media to try and expand their reach. This is an example of a British American tobacco campaign where they were paying influencers, people who have large followings through, I think it was Instagram and this one, to help to promote their products. And so those promotions then span national borders in a way that we know there's a big challenge in thinking about how it is that we regulate social media. In terms of exposure to advertising, these are a little old data, but they kind of show this tendency for increasingly youth are exposed to advertising. About 80% of youth in 2016 were exposed to advertising for e-cigarettes, and if I was to have the more recent data, I'm pretty certain that it would be even higher. And most of the exposure is happening at point of sale, so where it is that tobacco products are sold, convenience stores, gas stations, pharmacies, places where kids are also going, and we know that the display of tobacco products is really an important part of how it is that tobacco products are promoted nowadays, and so it's through that space that kids are mostly getting their exposure to e-cigarette advertising. They're also being exposed online. And on TV, e-cigarette ads, it's legal to put them on TV, and so some of those are reaching kids as well. And then finally, through newspapers, print media, kids aren't paying attention to that as much, but still it seems to be reaching them through print media. Flavors is another component that I mentioned before. 85% of e-cigarette users use flavors. Not users, but adolescent users use flavors. I mentioned the the flavors from Juul, but you may or may not know that there are thousands of these flavors that are available where you can use these eyedroppers to reload the different tank system devices that I described earlier. A lot of them are in the category of kind of fruits and pastries like the apple pie a la mode, or candies are increasingly prohibited, but they're still out there. You can't refer as directly to candy flavors nowadays. Also alcoholic drinks, which we know would be the kind of thing that might appeal to older adolescents. And just to kind of show at the extremes to which it goes, my favorite flavors are bacon-wrapped jalapeno poppers and fried chicken and waffles. So, you know, you can really get any number of flavors, literally thousands and thousands of flavors that are out there depending on what you're into. The other thing that's important to underscore is that while the liquids are often available with different levels of nicotine, the vast majority of sales are of products that include nicotine. Okay? Almost 100% of products that are sold include nicotine. And all of the Juul products contain nicotine. Most kids, 2 out of every 3 kids who use Juuls don't realize that they always contain nicotine. And so that's another issue that is certainly important for us when we think about how it is that we want to promote policies around these products. You know, some of it's going to be through the warning labels that are on the products, and Juul has now voluntarily put on the FDA recommended warning about nicotine. So yeah, 1 in 5 middle schools have seen Juul used at school, and these are data from 2018. So we expect that it might be higher. You probably have heard some of the stories about people Juuling in bathrooms, Juuling actually in class. There are YouTube videos that you can see, you can find that give you instructions on how it is to use Juul in a way that you're not exhaling the vapor. And so kids can kind of hide even that component. And obviously, since it doesn't smell like cigarettes, it's easier to hide as well because of the lack of the olfactory trail. So most of youth Juul users say that they got it at point of sale, at like regular places where people can buy products, not necessarily through their social networks. And so there are some issues around access that the FDA has been trying to work on. And as I mentioned before, 2 out of 3 Juul users didn't know that nicotine's always in the device. One of the things that's also important about these devices that I was talking to Mike Cummings about earlier today, and he knows a little bit more about this than I do, but I listen to the chemists who talk about this. And you know, part of what happens is this nicotine solution that's inside the pods is that it's a nicotine salt, so it's a nicotine bound to a salt compound. And what that does, as I understand it, is that it creates the vapor, the aerosol, at lower temperatures, and also with a lower pH, so it's more acidic, and that makes it easier for kids to inhale it down into their lungs. And so we know from kind of the history of how it is that cigarettes were designed and made it easy for people to inhale the cigarette smoke down into the lungs, that is one of the ways in which we can facilitate addiction. And so it makes it easier for kids to inhale than inhaling the normal combustible cigarettes. I was going to show this FDA commercial, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it now. If we have time at the end, maybe I'll throw it in. But one of the things that FDA has done in response to the growing use of e-cigarettes is have a TV campaign where they're talking about some of these issues around how no nicotine product is safe, including e-cigarettes, although the evidence suggests that e-cigarettes are less harmful than combustible cigarettes. But the main issue for youth is around how it is that nicotine can influence brain development. How it is that it can harm attention, learning, and memory, and even promote mood disorders and influence impulse control, which we know is an issue amongst adolescents in general. And another concern, although there's some controversy around how kind of true it is around whether e-cigarettes are attracting people who wouldn't have otherwise become smokers to start vaping, and then from there go on to start using combustible cigarettes. So those are some of the concerns that we have in the public health community around youth use, and I'll show you this ad at the end if we have time. So the other thing that I want to draw your attention to are these heated tobacco products that I mentioned before are coming onto the market. Here you can see on the left what the device is comprised of. You basically have 3 components: a charger, which here's a charger that I'll pass around. You have the heating device right here, which you kind of you put in here and kind of recharge it when you're not using it. And then you have the actual, what they call heat sticks, which are like little cigarettes that, like here, stubby, reconstituted tobacco that they stick in here, and you just put it in here, and there's a blade that goes into the center of the tobacco, and it heats the tobacco up to the point where it frees up the nicotine as well as some of the other substances in an aerosol that you can then inhale, and has a similar kind of impact on the body to what regular cigarettes do. I mean, one of the issues that one of the potential benefits is that it does appear to include fewer toxicants, fewer carcinogens, as you can see in some of the research that was done by our colleague Maciej Ganowicz a while ago. Comparing cigarettes to heated tobacco products to e-cigarettes, you can see there's kind of lower and lower levels of these carcinogens as you move across the three different products. But one of the concerns is around how attractive these are going to be to youth. My impression as somebody who studied some of this stuff is that this is going to mostly appeal to established tobacco users, less to youth, particularly in the context of the e-cigarettes and the Juul devices that are out there and widely available. Usually when Philip Morris goes in and establishes a market, they set up these shops that look very much like an Apple store, super clean, super high tech. You have consultants in there that kind of show you how the device works. When you walk in, there's a place where you put your cigarettes. The idea is that you're only allowed to buy the product if you're a current cigarette smoker. And the idea is you leave your cigarettes at the door. That's the philosophy. What's interesting for me is that they also very much tie the product to tobacco, which in some ways is helping to differentiate it from e-cigarettes, because e-cigarettes don't have tobacco in them. But saying, hey, this is a tobacco product. They even have tobacco hanging on the walls in glass cases as though you were in a museum. And then you can see here's the display that kind of shows you how it works. That thing that kind of looks like a sideways U, that's the heating blade that you seat the tobacco on to kind of heat it up and release the aerosol. And then they sit down with you. This is me sitting down with a guy in South Africa where it was legal at the time to buy these things. They brought me a cappuccino, and they brought me a number of different flavors to try. And it was a really kind of nice experience. But I did have to show them a pack of cigarettes to be able to go through this process with them. And I did end up buying a pack, although when I registered in their database, they never got back in touch with me. They said they were going to follow up with me and see how I was doing, but they never did. And then the advertising is also helping to differentiate it from the combustible cigarettes and from e-cigarettes. So it's true, in other words, it is tobacco. It heats, and so it heats instead of burning, kind of like an e-cigarette does. And it's clean, so it's not as nasty as what it is that you get for combustible tobacco. And these products have taken off in Japan, also in South Korea, a little bit in Europe, and we're going to see what happens in the US market sometime soon. When the industry starts to project out the growth of different product segments around the world, they've imagined that in the coming years, these green bars here are going to represent the growth of heated tobacco products going forward. And so there's this expectation that they're really going to grow at a faster rate than we've seen for e-cigarettes, although these projections here are not taking into consideration the explosion of Juul, which, as I said earlier, is increasingly being distributed and marketed in other countries beside the US. The US is kind of the case study for what happens with Juul. So, what I hope that you all will take away from this is that, e-cigarettes are a tobacco product that produces an aerosol by heating a liquid that typically contains nicotine, flavorings, and other chemicals. And also that, there's a number of factors that contribute to why it is that e-cigarettes are so popular amongst youth, but it includes the mix of advertising, the flavors that are available, and also the nicotine that's present in the product. And so, thank you for listening.